The President of the United States, Joe Biden, is hosting leaders from across the African continent in Washington, D.C. from today, December 13th, 2022, I beg your pardon, to the 15th for the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. The summit will demonstrate the United States' enduring commitment to Africa and will underscore the importance of U.S. Africa relations and increase cooperation on shared global priorities. Joining us all the way from Washington is Ghanaian journalist Wilberforce Asare to let in on, of course, what to expect. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Asare. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right. There have been, questions with regards, the relevance of this summit, from persons wondering why African leaders have to go all the way to the U.S. for an Africa summit. And then also I saw Ugandan opposition leader Bobby Wine post a video where they were staging a small protest in the U.S., asking that the United States stop allowing dictators like the Ugandan president to visit, or granting them audience. So I want, your views on the relevance of the Africa Summit in the first place.
Well, so I think the question you asked is a very important one, and that's because the U.S. Africa Summit started in 2014 under former President Barack Obama. Now, from 2014, when the first one was held, till date, 2022, no U.S. Africa Summit has been held. And you do know the history. After 2016, President Trump became president of the United States, and he was clearly not interested in anything to do with Africa. However, President Joe Biden, who was the vice president to President Barack Obama when he initiated this, has decided to revive the vision of his former boss. And that's the reason why in 2022, that's about how many years? About 8 years after the first one was held, another edition of the U.S. Africa Summit is being held. Now, we know from across the globe that various superpowers such as China, Russia, Turkey, France, Japan, and even the European Union have been having such summits with African leaders. However, over the years, these summits have become more of talk shops and places where Africa is seen as a problem to be solved rather than a place of opportunity. So it is understandable that people will have opposition to the U.S. gathering all of African leaders. We are told that over 40 African leaders are already in Washington, D.C., attending this particular conference. But nevertheless, there is evidence to show that in the past, certain things that the United States has done for Africa has made impact. You remember in the Bush era, it started with a program that saw to various constructions taking place in Africa and also helping to fight the HIV menace with over $100 billion. Again, in the time of Clinton, he did start the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, AGWA, which also had a lot of impact on the African continent. And then we also know that President Barack Obama's initiatives on Africa helped to bring electricity to several parts of the continent. So there is evidence to show that some effort has been made by the United States to help Africa. But in recent time, we do know that China has literally taken over from the United States in terms of investments in Africa. So China's trade with Africa at 2021 stood at about 261 billion United States dollars. And that of the United States to Africa stood at just 64 billion United States dollars. If you calculate the difference, it's very huge. And so we are told that the American authorities are looking at how they can revive their relationship with Africa and take over the spot in terms of the biggest investor in Africa from China, so that the United States can regain that position that it held until 2016, 2017, thereabout. So your question you asked, it is okay for people not to be happy with the summit or America trying to build relationships with Africa. It's also okay for some people to oppose certain leaders from coming here because they are dictators back in their countries and all that. However, there is also good aspects of this kind of summit, and it appears everyone is looking forward to the big announcement that the President of the United States is likely to make as far as Africa is concerned.
I'd like to ask, what are some of the other things we're looking to expect in this summit? We also know that this summit comes after 4 years of Donald Trump's America First approach to foreign policy, and now we're seeing that they're having these conversations with Africa. Now, the U.S. has pledged to contribute $55 billion to Africa in the course of 3 years. Now, there are countries on the continent that are dealing with financial challenges. We had a conversation about Ghana last week and the debt profile, and we talked about Nigeria. So there are countries on the continent. How important is this or not to the African continent, and what other conversations are to be expected from the president as the next 2 days unfold?
So another interesting question, and that's because if there is anything that Africa is looking for currently, Africa is looking to rebound its economy post-COVID-19 and also post the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on African economies. And so that will also mean that African leaders are looking for debt forgiveness and looking for very huge investments that will help shore up the economies that are all affected. And so that is something that a lot of participants that are taking part in this summit are looking ahead. Again, a few months ago, the president of Ghana, Nana Addo Akufo-Addo, did indicate that it was time for Africa to be admitted to be a member of the group of 20, the G20. Now, we are told that that call that he made at an international summit has been heeded to by the American authorities. And so President Joe Biden is expected to announce American support for the African Union to have a seat at the group of 20, making it the group of 21, I believe. And so that's something that people are looking forward to. Again, the United States believes that Africa must have greater representation at international institutions such as the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank and all that. And so the United States president is expected to also indicate his support for these calls for greater African representation in international institutions such as I have mentioned. So these are some of the things that are expected. Again, we are told by various speakers and various international actors that the summit, the United States intends to use to put together a string of serious business deals between American companies and African countries. In recent time, it appears that companies in countries like Turkey and Russia and France are having more interaction and dealings with African countries than companies from the United States. So Russia has taken over the supply of arms as the biggest arms dealer with African countries. And then Turkey is also investing a lot by way of its trade relations in Africa. China, we all know, is doing a lot of construction across the length and breadth of African countries. And all of these are concerns to the United States. And they are hoping that this summit will be a stepping stone to revive the relationship that has existed between Africa and America in time past.
Well, Mr. Asare, and that's a good point, to a good place to step in, because I want to ask, from your opinion, how genuine or how sincere are these moves being made? Because Africa now seems like a bride. There is, of course, the parts where Africa still has mineral resources that will be relevant in future industrial revolutions. The United States, over time, has made these moves. We've already stated that, China and Russia and Turkey have, seemingly been more beneficial to the continent than the United States. But I want to ask, how sincere are these moves by the United States? Is it really just to turn the continent away from its attention to China and Russia to be on its side? Or is the United States really interested in a developed Africa? Because I'm sure you must be aware, over time, since colonization, there has been France and its involvement in Africa, there's been the United States, there's been Britain. But I don't know that the involvement in African countries and on the continent has been really beneficial to the continent on that level. So are they really just trying to chase China away and chase Russia away, or do they really want to develop Africa?
Well, so I can see that you are a student of international politics. And because you are a student of international politics, you understand that the United States puts its interests first beyond everything else. So for everything that the United States, the underpinning or the undercurrent of what they are doing will be United States interest. Now, having said that, it is obvious that the United States, in its engagement with Africa, is looking at how it can profit more than it is looking at how it can impact Africa. But over the period, it's become very clear and obvious that the African continent is no longer just a problem, but also a place of opportunity. And that's because currently, globally, African continent has the biggest demographic dividend. And so when you talk about population and population age and size, Africa has the best population and the best population size. And over the next few years, we are told that Africa will become the go-to place in terms of large markets because of the huge population and also its youthfulness. Again, if you talk about natural resources, Africa has the biggest deposits of natural resources that are yet to be tapped. And that's because we do not have the technology to tap into the resources that are embedded on the African continent. I know somebody will say that we've been extracting oil, gold, and what have you. It is true, but there remains huge deposits of various minerals, especially things that will be needed for climate change in the future. And so even though the United States is thinking about its interest, African leaders are also getting the picture that we have the resources, we have what it takes to be the go-to place. And so going into such meetings, it's more of negotiating and making sure that Africa can get its better share from what it offers the world, rather than the previous position, which has been Africa just giving to the West without getting any returns.
On a final note, the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Relations has said that this is an opportunity for the U.S. to show Africa that it listens to them. Now, last week also we had President Macky Sall in Dakar saying that, you know, Africans are not being listened to, and that, you know, we don't want anybody to tell us don't work with so and so. This is who we want you to work with. That they want the liberty to work and trade and do business with everyone. What difference are we going to expect after this conference? And, you know, why is it important, you know, now this conversation about listening to Africa, hearing Africa, why is that conversation important? And what really is going to be different from this conference?
Well, yeah, so it is important that Africa gets listened to. And that's because I agree with President Macky Sall that over the period, Africa has not been listened to. Africa has not been listened to by the West because, like I said earlier, we have always been seen as a problem to be solved instead of a place of opportunity. So if you have a problem to be solved, if you go begging somebody to give you money, you don't expect the person to give you what you deserve. The person will give you what he or she has. And so that is what has been the situation for a very long time. But I believe that you have heard the mantra, Africa beyond aid, how that the entire African continent is thinking and believing that it can live beyond aid from Western countries by leveraging on the resources that it has and exchanging the resources they have for the needs that Africa has, instead of going begging for arms, grants, and loans and what have you. Over the period, everything has shown that the loans that Africa has gotten has not helped us, because if that could have helped us, probably we should have been helped by now. But in spite of all the grants and the loans that have been advanced to Africa, Africa appears to still fight this issue about development and growth. So I think that it's time that Africa gets ahead, and hopefully the United States, being the superpower of the world, once it takes the step by hearing Africa, eventually the rest of the world, who are all willing to deal with Africa, will also hear Africa. So for example, China has its own conference that he holds with Africa. Russia also has its own conferences that it holds with Africa. Same with Turkey, France, Japan, and the European Union. Hopefully, when the biggest country in the world, the biggest economy in the world, hears Africa, all these other countries will also give Africa a listening ear. Wow. And hopefully, Agenda 2063 should be realized.
Mr. Asare, just like a popular saying goes, Africa needs trade and not aid. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and we wish you a really interesting stay over there at the summit.